The Devil and the Deep Sea, an adventure tale by Rudyard Kipling. All supplies very bad and dear, and there are no facilities for even the smallest repairs. Sailing directions. Her nationality was British, but you will not find her house flag in the list of our mercantile marine. She was a 900-ton, iron, schooner-rigged, screw cargo boat, differing externally in no way from any other tramp of the sea. But it is with steamers as it is with men. There are those who will, for a consideration, sail extremely close to the wind, and in the present state of a fallen world, such people and such steamers have their use. From the hour that the Aglaia first entered the Clyde, new, shiny and innocent, with a quart of cheap champagne trickling down her cutwater, Fate and her owner, who was also her captain, decreed that she should deal with embarrassed crowned heads, fleeing presidents, financiers of overextended ability, women to whom change of air was imperative, and the lesser law-breaking powers. Her career led her sometimes into the Admiralty courts, where the sworn statements of her skipper filled his brethren with envy. The mariner cannot tell or act a lie in the face of the sea, or mislead a tempest. But, as lawyers have discovered, he makes up for chances withheld when he returns to shore, an affidavit in either hand. The Aglaia figured with distinction in the great Mackinaw salvage case. It was her first slip from virtue, and she learned how to change her name, but not her heart, and to run across the sea. As the guiding light, she was very badly wanted in a South American port for the little matter of entering harbour at full speed, colliding with a coal hulk and the state's only man of war, just as that man of war was going to coal. She put to sea without explanations, though 3 forts fired at her for half an hour. As the Julia MacGregor, she had been concerned in picking up from a raft certain gentlemen who should have stayed in Noumea, but who preferred making themselves vastly unpleasant to authority in quite another quarter of the world. And as the Shah-in-Shah, she had been overtaken on the high seas, indecently full of munitions of war, by the cruiser of an agitated power at issue with its neighbour. That time she was very nearly sunk, and her riddled hull gave eminent lawyers of 2 countries great profit. After a season, she reappeared as the Martin Hunt, painted a dull slate colour with pure saffron funnel and boats of robin's egg blue, engaging in the Odessa trade till she was invited, and the invitation could not well be disregarded, to keep away from Black Sea ports altogether. She had ridden through many waves of depression. Freights might drop out of sight, seamen's unions throw spanners and nuts at certificated masters, or stevedores combine till cargo perished on the dockhead. But the boat of many names came and went, busy, alert, and inconspicuous always. Her skipper made no complaint of hard times, and port officers observed that her crew signed and signed again with the regularity of Atlantic liner boatswains. Her name she changed as occasion called, her well-paid crew never, and a large percentage of the profits of her voyages was spent with an open hand on her engine room. She never troubled the underwriters, and very seldom stopped to talk with a signal station, for her business was urgent and private. But an end came to her tradings, and she perished in this manner. Deep peace brooded over Europe, Asia, Africa, America, Australasia, and Polynesia. The powers dealt together more or less honestly. Banks paid their depositors to the hour. Diamonds of price came safely to the hands of their owners. Republics rested content with their dictators. Diplomats found no one whose presence in the least incommoded them. Monarchs lived openly with their lawfully wedded wives. It was as though the whole earth had put on its best Sunday bib and tucker, and business was very bad for the Martin Hunt. The great, virtuous calm engulfed her, slate sides, yellow funnel and all, but cast up in another hemisphere, the steam whaler Haliotis, black and rusty, with a manure-coloured funnel, a litter of dingy white boats, and an enormous stove or furnace for boiling blubber on her forward well deck. There could be no doubt that her trip was successful, for she lay at several ports not too well known, and the smoke of her trying out insulted the beaches. Anon she departed, at the speed of the average London four-wheeler, and entered a semi-inland sea, warm, still, and blue, which is, perhaps, the most strictly preserved water in the world. There she stayed for a certain time, and the great stars of those mild skies beheld her playing puss in the corner among islands where whales are never found. All that while she smelt abominably, and the smell, though fishy, was not whalesome. One evening, calamity descended upon her from the island of Watai, and she fled, while her crew jeered at a fat black and brown gunboat puffing far behind. They knew to the last revolution the capacity of every boat on those seas that they were anxious to avoid. A British ship with a good conscience does not, as a rule, flee from the man-of-war of a foreign power, and it is also considered a breach of etiquette to stop and search British ships at sea. These things the skipper of the Haliotis did not pause to prove, but held on at an inspiriting 11 knots an hour till nightfall. One thing only he overlooked: the power that kept an expensive steam patrol moving up and down those waters. They had dodged the 2 regular ships of the station with an ease that bred contempt, had newly brought up a 3rd and a 14-knot boat with a clean bottom to help the work, and that was why the Haliotis, driving hard from the east to the west, found herself at daylight in such a position that she could not help seeing an arrangement of 4 flags, a mile and a half behind, which read, "Heave to, or take the consequences." She had her choice, and she took it. The end came when, presuming on her lighter draught, she tried to draw away northward over a friendly shoal. The shell that arrived by way of the chief engineer's cabin was some 5 inches in diameter, with a practice, not a bursting charge. It had been intended to cross her bows, and that was why it knocked the framed portrait of the chief engineer's wife, and she was a very pretty girl, onto the floor, splintered his wash-hand stand, crossed the alleyway into the engine room, and striking on a grating, dropped directly in front of the forward engine, where it burst, neatly fracturing both the bolts that held the connecting rod to the forward crank. What follows is worth consideration. The forward engine had no more work to do. Its released piston rod, therefore, drove up fiercely, with nothing to check it, and started most of the nuts of the cylinder cover. It came down again, the full weight of the steam behind it, and the foot of the disconnected connecting rod, useless as the leg of a man with a sprained ankle, flung out to the right and struck the starboard or right-hand cast-iron supporting column of the forward engine, cracking it clean through about 6 inches above the base and wedging the upper portion outwards 3 inches towards the ship's side. There the connecting rod jammed. Meantime, the after engine, being as yet unembarrassed, went on with its work, and in so doing brought round at its next revolution the crank of the forward engine, which smote the already jammed connecting rod, bending it and therewith the piston rod crosshead, the big crosspiece that slides up and down so smoothly. The crosshead jammed sideways in the guides, and in addition to putting further pressure on the already broken starboard supporting column, cracked the port or left-hand supporting column in 2 or 3 places. There being nothing more that could be made to move, the engines brought up, all standing, with a hiccup that seemed to lift the Haliotis a foot out of the water, and the engine-room staff, opening every steam outlet that they could find in the confusion, arrived on deck somewhat scalded but calm. There was a sound below of things happening, a rushing, clicking, purring, grunting, rattling noise that did not last for more than a minute. It was the machinery adjusting itself on the spur of the moment to 100 altered conditions. Mr. Wardrop, 1 foot on the upper grating, inclined his ear sideways and groaned. You cannot stop engines working at 12 knots an hour in 3 seconds without disorganizing them. The Haliotis slid forward in a cloud of steam, shrieking like a wounded horse. There was nothing more to do. The 5-inch shell with a reduced charge had settled the situation, and when you are full, all 3 holds of strictly preserved pearls. When you have cleaned out the Tanner Bank, the Seahorse Bank, and 4 other banks from one end to the other of the Amanala Sea, when you have ripped out the very heart of a rich government monopoly so that 5 years will not repair your wrongdoings. You must smile and take what is in store. But the skipper reflected, as a launch put out from the man-of-war, that he had been bombarded on the high seas with the British flag, several of them picturesquely disposed above him, and tried to find comfort from the thought. "Where?" said the stolid naval lieutenant, hoisting himself aboard. "Where are those damn pearls?" They were there beyond evasion. No affidavit could do away with the fearful smell of decayed oysters, the diving dresses, and the shell-littered hatches. They were there to the value of £70,000, more or less, and every pound poached. The man-of-war was annoyed, for she had used up many tons of coal, she had strained her tubes, and worse than all, her officers and crew had been hurried. Everyone on the Haliotis was arrested and rearrested several times as each officer came aboard. Then they were told by what they esteemed to be the equivalent of a midshipman that they were to consider themselves prisoners, and finally were put under arrest. "It's not the least good," said the skipper suavely. "You'd much better send us a tow." "Be still. You are arrest," was the reply. "Where the devil do you expect we're going to escape to? We're helpless. You've got to tow us into somewhere and explain why you fired on us. Mr. Wardrop, we're helpless, aren't we?" "Ruined from end to end," said the man of machinery. "If she rolls, the forward cylinder will come down and go through her bottom. Both columns are clean cut through. There's nothing to hold anything up." The Council of War clanked off to see if Mr. Wardrop's words were true. He warned them that it was as much as a man's life was worth to enter the engine room, and they contented themselves with a distant inspection through the thinning steam. The Haliotis lifted to the long, easy swell, and the starboard supporting column ground a trifle, as a man grits his teeth under the knife. The forward cylinder was depending on that unknown force men call the pertinacity of materials, which now and then balances that other heartbreaking power, the perversity of inanimate things. "You see," said Mr. Wardrop, hurrying them away, "the engines aren't worth their price as old iron." "We tow," was the answer. "Afterwards, we shall confiscate." The man-of-war was short-handed, and did not see the necessity for putting a prize crew aboard the Haliotis. So she sent one sub-lieutenant, whom the skipper kept very drunk, for he did not wish to make the tow too easy, and moreover, he had an inconspicuous little rope hanging from the stem of his ship. Then they began to tow at an average speed of 4 knots an hour. The Haliotis was very hard to move, and the gunnery lieutenant, who had fired the 5-inch shell, had leisure to think upon consequences. Mr. Wardrop was the busy man. He borrowed all the crew to shore up the cylinders with spars and blocks from the bottom and sides of the ship. It was a day's risky work, but anything was better than drowning at the end of a tow rope, and if the forward cylinder had fallen, it would have made its way to the seabed and taken the Haliotis after. "Where are we going to, and how long will they tow us?" he asked of the skipper. "God knows, and this prize lieutenant's drunk. What do you think you can do?" "There's just the bare chance," Mr. Wardrop whispered, though no one was within hearing. "There's just the bare chance of repairing her, if a man knew how. They've twisted the very guts out of her, bringing her up with that jerk. But I'm saying that, with time and patience, there's just the chance of making steam yet. We could do it." The skipper's eye brightened. "Do you mean," he began, "that she is any good?" "Oh, no," said Mr. Wardrop. "She'll need £3,000 in repairs at the lowest, if she's to take the sea again, and that apart from any injury to her structure. She's like a man fallen down 5 pair of stairs. We can't tell for months what has happened, but we know she'll never be good again without a new inside. You should see the condenser tubes and the steam connections to the donkey for 2 things only. I'm not afraid of them repairing her. I'm afraid of them stealing things. They've fired on us. They'll have to explain that. Our reputation's not good enough to ask for explanations. Let's take what we have and be thankful. You would not have consuls remembering the guiding light and the Shah-in-Shah and the Aglaya at this most alarming crisis. We've been no better than pirates these 10 years. Under Providence, we're no worse than thieves now. We've much to be thankful for. if we e'er get back to her. Make it your own way, then, said the skipper. If there's the least chance— I'll leave none, said Mr. Wardrop. None that they'll dare to take. Keep her heavy on the tow, for we need time. The skipper never interfered with the affairs of the engine-room, and Mr. Wardrop, an artist in his profession, turned to and composed a work terrible and forbidding. His background was the dark-grained sides of the engine-room. His material, the metals of power and strength, helped out with spars, balks, and ropes. The man-of-war towed sullenly and viciously. The Haliotis behind her hummed like a hive before swarming. With extra and totally unneeded spars, her crew blocked up the space round the forward engine till it resembled a statue in its scaffolding, and the butts of the shores interfered with every view that a dispassionate eye might wish to take, and that the dispassionate mind might be swiftly shaken out of its calm. The well-sunk bolts of the shores were wrapped round untidily with loose ends of ropes, giving a studied effect of most dangerous insecurity. Next, Mr. Wardrop took up a collection from the after engine, which, as you will remember, had not been affected in the general wreck. The cylinder escape valve he abolished with a flogging hammer. It is difficult in far-off ports to come by such valves, unless, like Mr. Wardrop, you keep duplicates in store. At the same time, men took off the nuts of two of the great holding-down bolts that serve to keep the engines in place on their solid bed. An engine violently arrested in mid-career may easily jerk off the nut of a holding-down bolt, and this accident looked very natural. Passing along the tunnel, he removed several shaft coupling bolts and nuts, scattering other and ancient pieces of iron underfoot. Cylinder bolts he cut off to the number of 6 from the after-engine cylinder, so that it might match its neighbour, and stuffed the bilge and feed pumps with cotton waste. Then he made up a neat bundle of the various odds and ends that he had gathered from the engines, little things like nuts and valve spindles, all carefully tallowed, and retired with them under the floor of the engine-room, where he sighed, being fat, as he passed from manhole to manhole of the double bottom, and in a fairly dry submarine compartment hid them. Any engineer, particularly in an unfriendly port, has a right to keep his spare stores where he chooses, and the foot of one of the cylinder shores blocked all entrance into the regular storeroom, even if that had not been already closed with steel wedges. In conclusion, he disconnected the after-engine, laid piston and connecting rod, carefully tallowed where it would be most inconvenient to the casual visitor, took out 3 of the 8 collars of the thrust block, hid them where only he could find them again, filled the boilers by hand, wedged the sliding doors of the coal bunkers, and rested from his labours. The engine-room was a cemetery, and it did not need the contents of the ash lift through the skylight to make it any worse. He invited the skipper to look at the completed work. "Saw ye ever such a forsaken wreck as that?" said he proudly. "It almost frights me to go under those shores. Now, what do you think they'll do to us?" "Wait till we see," said the skipper. "It'll be bad enough when it comes." He was not wrong. The pleasant days of towing ended all too soon. Though the Haliotis trailed behind her, a heavily weighted jib stayed out into the shape of a pocket, and Mr. Wardrop was no longer an artist of imagination, but one of 27 prisoners in a prison full of insects. The man-of-war had towed them to the nearest port, not to the headquarters of the colony, and when Mr. Wardrop saw the dismal little harbour, with its ragged line of Chinese junks, its one crazy tug, and the boat-building shed that, under the charge of a philosophical Malay, represented a dockyard, he sighed and shook his head. "I did well," he said. "This is the habitation of wreckers and thieves. We're at the uttermost ends of the earth. Think you they'll ever know in England?" "Doesn't look like it," said the skipper. They were marched ashore with what they stood up in, under a generous escort, and were judged according to the customs of the country, which, though excellent, are a little out of date. There were the pearls, there were the poachers, and there sat a small but hot governor. He consulted for a while, and then things began to move with speed, for he did not wish to keep a hungry crew at large on the beach, and the man-of-war had gone up the coast. With a wave of his hand, a stroke of the pen was not necessary. He consigned them to the black gang tana, the back country, and the hand of the law removed them from his sight and the knowledge of men. They were marched into the palms, and the back country swallowed them up, all the crew of the Haliotis. Deep peace continued to brood over Europe, Asia, Africa, America, Australasia, and Polynesia. It was the firing that did it. They should have kept their counsel. But when a few thousand foreigners are bursting with joy over the fact that a ship under the British flag has been fired at on the high seas, news travels quickly. And when it came out that the pearl-stealing crew had not been allowed access to their consul, there was no consul within a few hundred miles of that lonely port, even the friendliest of powers has a right to ask questions. The great heart of the British public was beating furiously on account of the performance of a notorious racehorse and had not a throb to waste on distant accidents. But somewhere deep in the hull of the ship of state there is machinery which more or less accurately takes charge of foreign affairs. That machinery began to revolve, and who so shocked and surprised as the power that had captured the Haliotis? It explained that colonial governors and faraway men of war were difficult to control, and promised that it would most certainly make an example both of the governor and the vessel. As for the crew reported to be pressed into military service in tropical climes, it would produce them as soon as possible, and it would apologize if necessary. Now, no apologies were needed. When one nation apologizes to another, millions of amateurs who have no earthly concern with the difficulty hurl themselves into the strife and embarrass the trained specialist. It was requested that the crew be found, if they were still alive. They had been 8 months beyond knowledge, and it was promised that all would be forgotten. The little governor of the little port was pleased with himself. 27 white men made a very compact force to throw away on a war that had neither beginning nor end, a jungle and stockade fight that flickered and smouldered through the wet, hot years in the hills 100 miles away, and was the heritage of every wearied official. He had, he thought, deserved well of his country, and if only someone would buy the unhappy Haliotis, moored in the harbour below his veranda, his cup would be full. He looked at the neatly silvered lamps that he had taken from her cabins and thought of much that might be turned to account. But his countrymen in that moist climate had no spirit. They would peep into the silent engine room and shake their heads. Even the men of war would not tow her further up the coast, where the governor believed that she could be repaired. She was a bad bargain, but her cabin carpets were undeniably beautiful, and his wife approved of her mirrors. 3 hours later, cables were bursting round him like shells, for though he knew it not, he was being offered as a sacrifice by the Nether to the upper millstone, and his superiors had no regard for his feelings. He had, said the cables, grossly exceeded his power and failed to report on events. He would, therefore, at this he cast himself back in his hammock, produce the crew of the Haliotis. He would send for them, and if that failed, he would put his dignity on a pony and fetch them himself. He had no conceivable right to make pearl poachers serve in any war. He would be held responsible. Next morning, the cables wished to know whether he had found the crew of the Haliotis. They were to be found, freed, and fed. He was to feed them, till such time as they could be sent to the nearest English port in a man of war. If you abuse a man long enough in great words flashed over the seabeds, things happen. The governor sent inland swiftly for his prisoners, who were also soldiers, and never was a militia regiment more anxious to reduce its strength. No power short of death could make these madmen wear the uniform of their service. They would not fight except with their fellows, and it was for that reason the regiment had not gone to war, but stayed in a stockade, reasoning with the new troops. The autumn campaign had been a fiasco, but here were the Englishmen. All the regiment marched back to guard them, and the hairy enemy, armed with blowpipes, rejoiced in the forest. 5 of the crew had died, but there lined up on the governor's veranda 22 men marked about the legs with the scars of leech bites. A few of them wore fringes that had once been trousers. The others used loincloths of gay patterns, and they existed beautifully but simply in the governor's veranda, and when he came out, they sang at him. When you have lost £70,000 worth of pearls, your pay, your ship, and all your clothes, and have lived in bondage for 5 months beyond the faintest pretenses of civilization. You know what true independence means, for you become the happiest of created things. Natural man. The governor told the crew that they were evil, and they asked for food. When he saw how they ate, and when he remembered that none of the Pearl Patrol boats were expected for 2 months, he sighed. But the crew of the Haliotis lay down in the veranda and said that they were pensioners of the governor's bounty. A grey-bearded man, fat and bald-headed, his one garment a green and yellow loincloth, saw the Haliotis in the harbour and bellowed for joy. The men crowded to the veranda rail, kicking aside the long cane chairs. They pointed, gesticulated, and argued freely, without shame. The militia regiment sat down in the governor's garden. The governor retired to his hammock. It was as easy to be killed lying as standing, and his women squeaked from the shuttered rooms. "She's sold," said the grey, tilde-bearded man, pointing to the Haliotis. He was Mr. Wardrop. "No good," said the governor, shaking his head. "No one come by." "He's taken my lamps, though," said the skipper. He wore one leg of a pair of trousers, and his eye wandered along the veranda. The governor quailed. There were cuddy camp stools and the skipper's writing table in plain sight. "They've cleaned her out, of course," said Mr. Wardrop. "They would. We'll go aboard and take an inventory. See?" He waved his hands over the harbour. "We live there now. Sorry?" The governor smiled a smile of relief. "He's glad of that," said one of the crew reflectively. "I shouldn't wonder." They flocked down to the harbour front, the militia regiment clattering behind, and embarked themselves in what they found. It happened to be the governor's boat. Then they disappeared over the bulwarks of the Haliotis, and the governor prayed that they might find occupation inside. Mr. Wardrop's first bound took him to the engine room, and when the others were patting the well-remembered decks, they heard him giving God thanks that things were as he had left them. The wrecked engine stood over his head untouched. No inexpert hand had meddled with his shores. The steel wedges of the storeroom were rusted home, and best of all, the 160 tons of good Australian coal in the bunkers had not diminished. "I don't understand it," said Mr. Wardrop. "Any Malay knows the use of copper. They ought to have cut away the pipes, and with Chinese junks coming here too. It's a special interposition or providence." "You think so?" said the skipper from above. "There's only been one thief here, and he's cleaned her out of all my things anyhow." Here the skipper spoke less than the truth, for under the planking of his cabin, only to be reached by a chisel, lay a little money which never drew any interest, his sheet anchor to windward. It was all in clean sovereigns that pass current the world over and might have amounted to more than £100. "He's left me alone. Let's thank God," repeated Mr. Wardrop. "He's taken everything else. Look!" The Haliotis, except as to her engine room, had been systematically and scientifically gutted from one end to the other, and there was strong evidence that an unclean guard had camped in the skipper's cabin to regulate that plunder. She lacked glass, plate, crockery, cutlery, mattresses, cuddy carpets and chairs, all boats, and her copper ventilators. These things had been removed, with her sails and as much of the wire rigging as would not imperil the safety of the masts. "He must have sold those," said the skipper. "The other things are in his house, I suppose." Every fitting that could be pried or screwed out was gone. Port, starboard, and masthead lights, teak gratings, sliding sashes of the deck-house, the captain's chest of drawers with charts and chart table, photographs, brackets, and looking-glasses, cabin doors, rubber cuddy mats, hatch irons, half the funnel stays, cork fenders, carpenter's grindstone and tool chest, holy stones, swabs, squeegees, all cabin and pantry lamps, galley fittings en bloc, flags and flag locker, clocks, chronometers, the forward compass and the ship's bell and belfry were among the missing. There were great scarred marks on the deck planking over which the cargo derricks had been hauled. One must have fallen by the way, for the bulwark rails were smashed and bent, and the side plates bruised. "It's the governor," said the skipper. "He's been selling her on the instalment plan." "Let's go up with spanners and shovels and kill 'em all," shouted the crew. "Let's drown him and keep the woman. Then we'll be shot by that black and tan regiment. Our regiment. What's the trouble ashore, Tilda? They've camped our regiment on the beach." "We're cut off. That's all. Go and see what they want," said Mr. Wardrop. "You've the trousers." In his simple way, the governor was a strategist. He did not desire that the crew of the Haliotis should come ashore again, either singly or in detachments, and he proposed to turn their steamer into a convict hulk. They would wait, he explained this from the quay to the skipper in the barge, and they would continue to wait till the man-of-war came along exactly where they were. If one of them set foot ashore, the entire regiment would open fire, and he would not scruple to use the 2 cannon of the town. Meantime, food would be sent daily in a boat under an armed escort. The skipper, bare to the waist and rowing, could only grind his teeth, and the governor improved the occasion and revenged himself for the bitter words in the cables by saying what he thought of the morals and manners of the crew. The barge returned to the Haliotis in silence, and the skipper climbed aboard, white on the cheekbones and blue about the nostrils. "I knew it," said Mr. Wardrop, "and they won't give us good food either. We shall have bananas morning, noon, and night, and a man can't work on fruit. We know that." Then the skipper cursed Mr. Wardrop for importing frivolous side issues into the conversation, and the crew cursed one another, and the Haliotis, the voyage, and all that they knew or could bring to mind. They sat down in silence on the empty decks, and their eyes burned in their heads. The green harbour water chuckled at them overside. They looked at the palm-fringed hills inland, at the white houses above the harbour road, at the single tier of native craft by the quay, at the stolid soldiery sitting round the 2 cannon, and last of all, at the blue bar of the horizon. Mr. Wardrop was buried in thought and scratched imaginary lines with his untrimmed fingernails on the planking. "I make no promise," he said at last, "for I can't say what may or may not have happened to them. But here's the ship, and here's us." There was a little scornful laughter at this, and Mr. Wardrop knitted his brows. He recalled that in the days when B wore trousers, he had been chief engineer of the Haliotis. Harland, Mackenzie, Noble, Hay, Norton, Fink, O'Hara, Trumbull. "Here, sir." The instinct of obedience waked to answer the roll call of the engine room. "Below." They rose and went. "Captain, I'll trouble you for the rest of the men as I want them. We'll get my stores out and clear away the shores we don't need, and then we'll patch her up. My men will remember that they're in the Haliotis, under me." He went into the engine room, and the others stared. They were used to the accidents of the sea, but this was beyond their experience. None who had seen the engine room believed that anything short of new engines from end to end could stir the Haliotis from her moorings. The engine room stores were unearthed, and Mr. Wardrop's face, red with the filth of the bilges and the exertion of travelling on his stomach, lit with joy. The spare gear of the Haliotis had been unusually complete, and 22 men, armed with screwjacks, differential blocks, tackle, vices, and a forge or so, can look kismet between the eyes without winking. The crew were ordered to replace the holding down and shaft-bearing bolts and return the collars of the thrust block. When they had finished, Mr. Wardrop delivered a lecture on repairing compound engines without the aid of the shops, and the men sat about on the cold machinery. The crosshead jammed in the guides leered at them drunkenly, but offered no help. They ran their fingers hopelessly into the cracks of the starboard supporting column and picked at the ends of the ropes round the shores, while Mr. Wardrop's voice rose and fell echoing, till the quick tropic night closed down over the engine room skylight. Next morning the work of reconstruction began. It has been explained that the foot of the connecting rod was forced against the foot of the starboard supporting column, which it had cracked through and driven outward towards the ship's skin. To all appearance, the job was more than hopeless, for rod and column seemed to have been welded into one. But herein Providence smiled on them for one moment to hearten them through the weary weeks ahead. The second engineer, more reckless than resourceful, struck at random with a cold chisel into the cast iron of the column, and a greasy grey flake of metal flew from under the imprisoned foot of the connecting rod, while the rod itself fell away slowly and brought up with a thunderous clang somewhere in the dark of the crankpit. The guides' plates above were still jammed fast in the guides, but the first blow had been struck. They spent the rest of the day grooming the donkey engine, which stood immediately forward of the engine room hatch. Its tarpaulin, of course, had been stolen, and 8 warm months had not improved the working parts. Further, the last dying hiccup of the Haliotis seemed, or it might have been the Malay from the boathouse, to have lifted the thing bodily on its bolts and set it down inaccurately as regarded its steam connections. "If we only had one single cargo derrick," Mr. Wardrop sighed. "We can take the cylinder cover off by hand if we sweat, but to get the rod out of the piston's not possible unless we use steam. Well, there'll be steam the morn if there's nothing else. She'll fizzle." Next morning, men from the shore saw the Haliotis through a cloud, for it was as though the deck smoked. Her crew were chasing steam through the shaken and leaky pipes to its work in the forward donkey engine, and where Oakham failed to plug a crack, they stripped off their loincloths for lapping and swore, half-boiled and mother-naked. The donkey engine worked, at a price, the price of constant attention and furious stoking, worked long enough to allow a wire rope. It was made up of a funnel and a foremast stay, to be led into the engine room and made fast on the cylinder cover of the forward engine. That rose easily enough, and was hauled through the skylight and onto the deck, many hands assisting the doubtful steam. Then came the tug of war, for it was necessary to get to the piston and the jammed piston rod. They removed 2 of the piston junk-ring studs, screwed in 2 strong iron eye-bolts by way of handles, doubled the wire rope, and set half a dozen men to smite with an extemporized battering ram at the end of the piston rod, where it peered through the piston, while the donkey engine hauled upwards on the piston itself. After 4 hours of this furious work, the piston rod suddenly slipped, and the piston rose with a jerk, knocking 1 or 2 men over into the engine room. But when Mr. Wardrop declared that the piston had not split, they cheered and thought nothing of their wounds, and the donkey engine was hastily stopped. Its boiler was nothing to tamper with, and day by day their supplies reached them by boat. The skipper humbled himself once more before the governor, and as a concession had leave to get drinking water from the Malay boat builder on the quay. It was not good drinking water, but the Malay was anxious to supply anything in his power if he were paid for it. Now, when the jaws of the forward engine stood, as it were, stripped and empty, they began to wedge up the shores of the cylinder itself. That work alone filled the better part of 3 days, warm and sticky days, when the hands slipped and sweat ran into the eyes. When the last wedge was hammered home, there was no longer an ounce of weight on the supporting columns, and Mr. Wardrop rummaged the ship for boilerplate 3/4 of an inch thick, where he could find it. There was not much available, but what there was more than beaten gold to him. In one desperate forenoon, the entire crew, naked and lean, hailed back, more or less into place, the starboard supporting column, which, as you remember, was cracked clean through. Mr. Wardrop found them asleep where they had finished the work, and gave them a day's rest, smiling upon them as a father, while he drew chalk marks about the cracks. They woke to new and more trying labour, for over each one of those cracks a plate of 3/4 inch boiler iron was to be worked hot, the rivet holes being drilled by hand. All that time they were fed on fruits, chiefly bananas, with some sago. Those were the days when men swooned over the ratchet drill and the hand forge, and where they fell they had leave to lie, unless their bodies were in the way of their fellows' feet. And so, Patch upon patch, and a patch over all, the starboard supporting column was clouted. But when they thought all was secure, Mr. Wardrop decreed that the noble patchwork would never support working engines. At the best, it could only hold the guide bars approximately true. The dead weight of the cylinders must be borne by vertical struts, and therefore a gang would repair to the bows and take out, with files, the big bow-anchor davits, each of which was some 3 inches in diameter. They threw hot coals at Wardrop and threatened to kill him. Those who did not weep, they were ready to weep on the least provocation, but he hit them with iron bars heated at the end, and they limped forward, and the davits came with them when they returned. They slept 16 hours on the strength of it, and in 3 days 2 struts were in place, bolted from the foot of the starboard supporting column to the underside of the cylinder. There remained now the port, or condenser column, which, though not so badly cracked as its fellow, had also been strengthened in 4 places with boilerplate patches, but needed struts. They took away the main stanchions of the bridge for that work, and crazy with toil, did not see till all was in place that the rounded bars of iron must be flattened from top to bottom to allow the air pump levers to clear them. It was Wardrop's oversight, and he wept bitterly before the men as he gave the order to unbolt the struts and flatten them with hammer and the flame. Now the broken engine was underpinned firmly, and they took away the wooden shores from under the cylinders and gave them to the robbed bridge, thanking God for even half a day's work on gentle, kindly wood instead of the iron that had entered into their souls. 8 months in the back country among the leashes, at a temperature of 84 degrees moist, is very bad for the nerves. They had kept the hardest work to the last, as boys save Latin prose, and, worn though they were, Mr. Wardrop did not dare to give them rest. The piston rod and connecting rod were to be straightened, and this was a job for a regular dockyard with every appliance. They fell to it, cheered by a little chalk showing of work done, and time consumed which Mr. Wardrop wrote up on the engine-room bulkhead. 15 days had gone, 15 days of killing labour, and there was hope before them. It is curious that no man knows how the rods were straightened. The crew of the Haliotis remember that week very dimly, as a fever patient remembers the delirium of a long night. There were fires everywhere, they say. The whole ship was one consuming furnace, and the hammers were never still. Now, there could not have been more than one fire at the most, for Mr. Wardrop distinctly recalls that no straightening was done except under his own eye. They remember, too, that for many years voices gave orders which they obeyed with their bodies, but their minds were abroad on all the seas. It seems to them that they stood through days and nights, slowly sliding a bar backwards and forwards through a white glow that was part of the ship. They remember an intolerable noise in their burning heads from the walls of the stokehole, and they remember being savagely beaten by men whose eyes seemed asleep. When their shift was over, they would draw straight lines in the air, anxiously and repeatedly, and would question one another in their sleep, crying, "Is she straight?" At last, they do not remember whether this was by day or by night, Mr. Wardrop began to dance clumsily and wept the while, and they too danced and wept and went to sleep twitching all over. And when they woke, men said that the rods were straightened, and no one did any work for 2 days, but lay on the decks and ate fruit. Mr. Wardrop would go below from time to time and pat the 2 rods where they lay, and they heard him singing hymns. Then his trouble of mind went from him, and at the end of the 3rd day's idleness he made a drawing in chalk upon the deck, with letters of the alphabet at the angles. He pointed out that, though the piston rod was more or less straight, the piston rod crosshead, the thing that had been jammed sideways in the guides, had been badly strained, and had cracked the lower end of the piston rod. He was going to forge and shrink a wrought iron collar on the neck of the piston rod where it joined the crosshead, and from the collar he would bolt a Y-shaped piece of iron whose lower arms should be bolted into the crosshead. If anything more were needed, they could use up the last of the boilerplate. So the forges were lit again, and men burned their bodies, but hardly felt the pain. The finished connection was not beautiful, but it seemed strong enough, at least as strong as the rest of the machinery, and with that job their labours came to an end. All that remained was to connect up the engines and to get food and water. The skipper and 4 men dealt with the Malay boat builder by night chiefly. It was no time to haggle over the price of sago and dried fish. The others stayed aboard and replaced piston, piston rod, cylinder cover, crosshead, and bolts with the aid of the faithful donkey engine. The cylinder cover was hardly steam-proof, and the eye of science might have seen in the connecting rod a flexure something like that of a Christmas tree candle, which has melted and been straightened by hand over a stove, but, as Mr. Wardrop said, she didn't hit anything. As soon as the last bolt was in place, men tumbled over one another in their anxiety to get to the hand starting gear, the wheel and worm, by which some engines can be moved when there is no steam aboard. They nearly wrenched off the wheel, but it was evident to the blindest eye that the engines stirred. They did not revolve in their orbits with any enthusiasm, as good machines should. Indeed, they groaned not a little, but they moved over and came to rest in a way which proved that they still recognized man's hand. Then Mr. Wardrop sent his slaves into the darker bowels of the engine-room and the stoke-hole, and followed them with a flare-lamp. The boilers were sound, but would take no harm from a little scaling and cleaning. Mr. Wardrop would not have anyone overzealous, for he feared what the next stroke of the tool might show. "The less we know about her now," said he, "the better for us all, I'm thinking. You'll understand me when I say that this is in no sense regular engineering." As his raiment, when he spoke, was his grey beard and uncut hair, they believed him. They did not ask too much of what they met, but polished and tallowed and scraped it to a false brilliancy. "A lick of paint would make me easier in my mind," said Mr. Wardrop plaintively. "I know half the condenser tubes are started, and the propeller shafting is God knows how far out of the true, and we'll need a new air pump, and the main steam leaks like a sieve, and there's worse each way I look, but paint's like clothes to a man, and ours is near all gone." The skipper unearthed some stale, ropey paint of the loathsome green that they used for the galleys of sailing ships, and Mr. Wardrop spread it abroad lavishly to give the engines self-respect. His own was returning day by day, for he wore his loincloth continuously, but the crew, having worked under orders, did not feel as he did. The completed work satisfied Mr. Wardrop. He would at the last have made shift to run to Singapore, and gone home without vengeance taken to show his engines to his brethren in the craft, but the others and the captain forbade him. They had not yet recovered their self-respect. It would be safer to make what you might call a trial trip, but beggars mustn't be choosers, and if the engines will go over to the hand gear, the probability, I'm only saying it's a probability, the chance is that they'll hold up when we put steam on her. "How long will you take to get steam?" said the skipper. "God knows. 4 hours, a day, half a week. If I can raise £60, I'll not complain. Be sure of her first. We can't afford to go out half a mile and break down. My soul and body, man, we're one continuous breakdown, fore and aft. We might fetch Singapore, though." "We'll break down at Paigang Watai, where we can do good," was the answer, in a voice that did not allow argument. "She's my boat, and I've had 8 months to think in." No man saw the Haliotis depart, though many heard her. She left at 2 in the morning, having cut her moorings, and it was none of her crew's pleasure that the engine should strike up a thundering half-seas-over chanty that echoed among the hills. Mr. Wardrop wiped away a tear as he listened to the new song. "She's gibbering. She's just gibbering," he whimpered. "Yon's the voice of a maniac." And if engines have any soul, as their masters believe, he was quite right. There were outcries and clamours, sobs and bursts of chattering laughter, silences where the trained ear yearned for the clear note, and torturing reduplications where there should have been one deep voice. Down the screw shaft ran murmurs and warnings, while a heart-diseased flutter without told that the propeller needed re-keying. "How does she make it?" said the skipper. "She moves, but she's breaking my heart. The sooner we're at Paigang Watai, the better. She's mad, and we're waking the town." Is she at all near safe? What do I care how safe she is? She's mad. Hear that now. To be sure, nothing's hitting anything, and the bearings are fairly cool, but can you not hear? If she goes, said the skipper, I don't care a curse, and she's my boat too. She went, trailing a fathom of weed behind her. From a slow 2 knots an hour, she crawled up to a triumphant 4. Anything beyond that made the struts quiver dangerously and filled the engine room with steam. Morning showed her out of sight of land, and there was a visible ripple under her bows. But she complained bitterly in her bowels, and, as though the noise had called it, there shot along across the purple sea a swift, dark proa, hawk-like and curious, which presently ranged alongside and wished to know if the Haliotis were helpless. Ships, even the steamers of the white men, had been known to break down in those waters, and the honest Malay and Javanese traders would sometimes aid them in their own peculiar way. But this ship was not full of lady passengers and well-dressed officers. Men, white, naked, and savage, swarmed down her sides. Some with red-hot iron bars and others with large hammers threw themselves upon those innocent inquiring strangers, and before any man could say what had happened, were in full possession of the proa, while the lawful owners bobbed in the water overside. Half an hour later, the proa's cargo of sago and trepang, as well as a doubtful-minded compass, was in the Haliotis. The 2 huge triangular mat sails, with their 70-foot yards and booms, had followed the cargo and were being fitted to the stripped masts of the steamer. They rose, they swelled, they filled, and the empty steamer visibly laid over as the wind took them. They gave her nearly 3 knots an hour, and what better could men ask? But if she had been forlorn before, this new purchase made her horrible to see. Imagine a respectable charwoman in the tights of a ballet dancer rolling drunk along the streets, and you will come to some faint notion of the appearance of that 900-ton, well-decked, once schooner-rigged cargo boat as she staggered under her new help, shouting and raving across the deep. With steam and sail that marvellous voyage continued, and the bright-eyed crew looked over the rail, desolate, unkempt, unshorn, shamelessly clothed beyond the decencies. At the end of the 3rd week, she sighted the island of Paigangwatai, whose harbour is the turning point of a Pearl Sea Patrol. Here the gunboats stay for a week, ere they retrace their line. There is no village at Paigangwatai, only a stream of water, some palms, and a harbour safe to rest in till the first violence of the southeast monsoon has blown itself out. They opened up the low coral beach, with its mound of whitewashed coal ready for supply, the deserted huts for the sailors, and the flagless flagstaff. Next day, there was no Haliotis, only a little proa rocking in the warm rain at the mouth of the harbour, whose crew watched with hungry eyes the smoke of a gunboat on the horizon. Months afterwards, there were a few lines in an English newspaper to the effect that some gunboat of some foreign power had broken her back at the mouth of some faraway harbour by running at full speed into a sunken wreck. The Finances of the Gods, a short story by Rudyard Kipling. The evening meal was ended in Duni Bagat's Chubara, and the old priests were smoking or counting their beads. A little naked child pattered in, with its mouth wide open, a handful of marigold flowers in one hand, and a lump of conserved tobacco in the other. It tried to kneel and make obeisance to Gobind, but it was so fat that it fell forward on its shaven head and rolled on its side, kicking and gasping, while the marigolds tumbled one way and the tobacco the other. Gobind laughed, set it up again, and blessed the marigold flowers as he received the tobacco. "From my father," said the child. "He has the fever and cannot come. Wilt thou pray for him, father?" "Surely, littlest, but the smoke is on the ground, and the night chill is in the airs, and it is not good to go abroad naked in the autumn." "I have no clothes," said the child, "and all today I have been carrying cow-dung cakes to the bazaar. It was very hot, and I'm very tired." It shivered a little, for the twilight was cool. Gobind lifted an arm under his vast, tattered quilt of many colours and made an inviting little nest by his side. The child crept in, and Gobind filled his brass-studded leather water pipe with the new tobacco. When I came to the chubara, the shaven head with the tuft atop and the beady black eyes looked out of the folds of the quilt as a squirrel looks out from his nest, and Gobind was smiling while the child played with his beard. I would have said something friendly, but remembered in time that if the child fell ill afterwards, I should be credited with the evil eye, and that is a horrible possession. "Sit thou still, Thumbling," I said, as it made to get up and run away. "Where is thy slate? And why has the teacher let such an evil character loose on the streets when there are no police to protect us weaklings? In which ward dost thou try to break thy neck with flying kites from the housetops?" "Nay, Sahib, nay," said the child, burrowing its face into Gobind's beard and twisting uneasily. "There was a holiday today among the schools, and I do not always fly kites. I play cricket like the rest. Cricket is the national game among the schoolboys of the Punjab, from the naked hedge school children who use an old kerosene tin for wicket to the B.A.s of the university who compete for the championship belt. Thou play cricket. Thou art half the height of the bat, I said. The child nodded resolutely. Yea, I do play. Purley ball, owat. Ran, I know it all. But thou must not forget with all this to pray to the gods according to custom, said Gobind, who did not altogether approve of cricket and Western innovations. I do not forget, said the child in a hushed voice. Also to give reverence to thy teacher, and, Gobind's voice softened, to abstain from pulling holy men by the beard, little badling. Eh? The child's face was altogether hidden in the great white beard, and it began to whimper till Gobind soothed it, as children are soothed all the world over, with the promise of a story. I did not think to frighten thee, senseless little one. Look up. Am I angry? Ah. Shall I weep too, and of our tears make a great pond and drown us both, and then thy father will never get well, lacking thee to pull his beard? Peace, and I will tell thee of the gods. Thou hast heard many tales. Very many, father. Now, this is a new one which thou hast not heard. Long and long ago, when the gods walked with men as they do today, but that we have not faith to see, Shiv, the greatest of gods, and Parbati, his wife, were walking in the garden of a temple. Which temple? That in the Nangaon ward, said the child. Nay, very far away. Maybe at Trimbak or Hurdwar, whither thou must make pilgrimage when thou art a man. Now, there was sitting in the garden under the jujube trees a mendicant that had worshipped Shiv for 40 years, and he lived on the offerings of the pious, and meditated holiness night and day. Oh, father, was it thou? Said the child, looking up with large eyes. Nay, I have said it was long ago, and moreover this mendicant was married. Did they put him on a horse with flowers on his head, and forbid him to go to sleep all night long? Thus they did to me when they made my wedding, said the child, who had been married a few months before. And what didst thou do? Said I. I wept, and they called me evil names, and then I smote her, and we wept together. Thus did not the mendicant, said Gobind, for he was a holy man and very poor. Parbati perceived him sitting naked by the temple steps, where all went up and down, and she said to Shiv, What shall men think of the gods when the gods thus scorn their worshippers? For 40 years yonder man has prayed to us, and yet there be only a few grains of rice and some broken cowries before him after all. Men's hearts will be hardened by this thing. And Shiv said, It shall be looked to. And so he called to the temple, which was the temple of his son, Ganesh of the elephant head, saying, "Son, there is a mendicant without who is very poor. What wilt thou do for him?" Then that great elephant-headed one awoke in the dark and answered, "In 3 days, if it be thy will, he shall have 1 lakh of rupees." Then Shiv and Parbati went away. But there was a money-lender in the garden hidden among the marigolds. The child looked at the ball of crumpled blossoms in its hands. Aye, among the yellow marigolds, and he heard the gods talking. He was a covetous man and of a black heart, and he desired that lakh of rupees for himself. So he went to the mendicant and said, "Oh, brother, how much do the pious give thee daily?" The mendicant said, "I cannot tell. Sometimes a little rice, sometimes a little pulse, and a few cowries, and it has been pickled mangoes and dried fish." "That is good," said the child, smacking its lips. Then said the moneylender, "Because I have long watched thee, and learned to love thee and thy patience, I will give thee now 5 rupees for all thy earnings of the 3 days to come. There is only a bond to sign on the matter." But the mendicant said, "Thou art mad. In 2 months I do not receive the worth of 5 rupees, and he told the thing to his wife that evening. She, being a woman, said, "When did moneylender ever make a bad bargain? The wolf runs through the corn for the sake of the fat deer. Our fate is in the hands of the gods. Pledge it not even for 3 days." So the mendicant returned to the moneylender and would not sell. Then that wicked man sat all day before him, offering more and more for those 3 days' earnings. First 10, 50, and 100 rupees. And then, for he did not know when the gods would pour down their gifts, rupees by the 1,000, till he had offered 500,000 of rupees. Upon this sum, the mendicant's wife shifted her counsel, and the mendicant signed the bond, and the money was paid in silver, great white bullocks bringing it by the cartload. But saving only all that money, the mendicant received nothing from the gods at all, and the heart of the moneylender was uneasy on account of expectation. Therefore, at noon of the 3rd day, the moneylender went into the temple to spy upon the counsels of the gods, and to learn in what manner that gift might arrive. Even as he was making his prayers, a crack between the stones of the floor gaped, and closing, caught him by the heel. Then he heard the gods walking in the temple in the darkness of the columns, and Shiv called to his son Ganesh, saying, "Son, what hast thou done in regard to the lakh of rupees for the mendicant?" And Ganesh woke, for the moneylender heard the dry rustle of his trunk uncoiling, and he answered, "Father, 1/2 of the money has been paid, and the debtor for the other half I hold here fast by the heel." The child bubbled with laughter. "And the moneylender paid the mendicant," it said. "Surely, for he whom the gods hold by the heel must pay to the uttermost. The money was paid at evening, all silver, in great carts, and thus Ganesh did his work." "Nathu! Oh hey, Nathu!" A woman was calling in the dusk by the door of the courtyard. The child began to wriggle. "That is my mother," it said. "Go then, littlest," answered Gobind, "but stay a moment." He ripped a generous yard from his patchwork quilt, put it over the child's shoulders, and the child ran away.